And I think with chimps, it's over 99%, you know, so it's not a bad model. Obviously, it's not perfect, but it always depends on what you compare it to. You know, and you hear animal rights activists say things like, well, we can replace that with computer simulations. It's like, no, we can't, because you can't simulate what you don't know, or at least not very well. So that's a silly idea. You know, even though they have a point, it's not so great to torture animals to death and all that, but what are his norms? Well, that's a good question. Where do norms for behavior come from? You have norms. When they're violated, it annoys you. Doesn't mean you know what your norms are, but you do kind of get a sense of what they are when they get violated. That really upset me. Well, what does that mean? Well, you don't really know. You might have to think about that for like 6 months, why you got so upset about that. But you can notice that you got upset, and that means that you do have expectations and norms, let's say, but you don't know where they came from. Now, obviously, in part, they came from your intrinsic structure, but also they're a consequence of your learning, but even more importantly, they're a consequence of your learning in a social environment. So all of those phenomena which exceed your comprehension determine the nature of your norms, and often you only detect them when they're violated. So because why bother paying attention to something that works? You just don't. No one does. They take it for granted. It's almost the definition of something working. It's like, you know, you think, I'm driving my car to school, and you think you're in a car, but you're really not in a car. You're in a thing that gets you from home to school. And you can pretend that, that is so annoying. You can pretend that so you might think, well, the thing that I'm in is, it's kind of a weird example, is this object with objective qualities that you call a car. But that isn't exactly how you actually perceive or act towards it. What happens is that as long as it's doing what it's supposed to do, which means that its function is intact, not what it is, but its function, then you can use a really low resolution representation of the thing. The car is just what gets you from point A to point B. Right? And so the fact that you don't understand the damn thing at all is completely invisible to you. But it isn't when it quits. As soon as it quits, it becomes a car. It's like, bang, car, oh my God, I don't understand this thing at all. Now what do I do? Well, you panic a little bit, right? Because, well, what do you know about your car? Nothing at all. And worse than that, now the car has become the intersection between you and whoever's going to fix your car. And so that introduces a whole bunch of human elements into it, like, are they going to figure out what's wrong with it? Are they going to rip you off? Is your car ever going to work again? Are you going to get to work? What's going to happen tonight? So all of a sudden that thing that you were in that was a car turns into this massive, complex, unbelievably complicated thing, and that's actually what it is. Your initial representation of it, it's like, it's really low resolution. It's like 1 bit, and then bang, it breaks down and poof, complexity, complexity, complexity everywhere. And that complexity, that's what the world's made out of. If you remember, we talked about William James and that crazy nitrous oxide induced pseudo hippie poetry that he was writing in the 1890s when he was talking about chaos. Well, that chaos that he was talking about, out of which order emerges, that's the same thing as that complexity that's hovering in the background. And children have to operate in a world that's actually that complex, but they're not smart enough, and neither are you. So they build partial representations that sort of work, and the parents scaffold them. So the way children manage this, like children, they don't know anything, but hey, they're still alive, so what's up with that? You know, part of it is the child is laying out one of its procedures in the world in accordance with its understanding, and something goes wrong. What does the child do? Cries, right? It defaults to this distress cry, and what happens is the adults move in with their superior skills and their enhanced understanding, and they mediate between the partial knowledge of the child and the actual complex world. And without the child, that's why if you take your child to the mall and just leave, you know, it doesn't take very long for them to get really, 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 really upset, you know, depending on the child. Some of them almost instantaneously, you know. One day I was in the Boston airport with my daughter. She was about 3 and 3.5 maybe, and my son, he was about 2, and we were there to pick someone up. It was just packed, and so I had them by the hand, you know, and I told my daughter a bunch, if she ever got separated from me in a crowd, just to sit down immediately wherever she was or as close thereby, and I would find her. Don't move. Well, somehow I got separated from them, and I looked behind them and they weren't there, and I found out later she'd followed someone else who looked like me from behind. And I found her in about 3 minutes, you know, which is a long time, man. If you're 3 years old at an airport, she was sitting there like paralyzed, you know. But her brother was with her and he didn't care at all. And the reason he didn't care is because as far as he was concerned, she was an adult. But as far as she was concerned, she was an abandoned kid in an airport. You know, it was very hard on her, and it's because, you know, she was protected from the complexity by her primordial representations and my presence. But as soon as my presence disappeared, the complexity came flooding back and just overwhelmed her. That's chaos and uncertainty. And then she'd cry, and the cry says, help, I'm out of my league, I'm drowning, you know. Intervene. And so that's how kids in part can get along in the world with their incomplete knowledge representations. It's always also how you get along in the world. Because it's incomplete beyond belief, but you got all these other people around you and the whole damn society filling in the gaps. And so you walk around like you know what you're doing, but you don't. You just hardly know it all. You know, if you can fit into that system, great. You've got it on your side, and you can use it to fill the gaps. That's also partly why people are so concerned with maintaining their social identity, like the real identity. I'm not talking about some surface identity, but you see, because you have set up a set of expectations and desires about how you want the world to unfold, and you do that within a social context. And as long as your desires and the actions of the community match, which means you're at home, roughly speaking, as long as they match, you stay emotionally regulated. You like that. That's why you can stay calm in here. It's like your desires are being played out by everyone else, because one of your desires is that none of these crazy primates starts brandishing a knife, for example, or even twitching, or any of that sort of thing. You don't want any of that. And if it starts happening, it's like you get wary very quickly, and maybe you'll look and maybe you won't, and maybe you'll freeze, maybe you'll get the hell out of there, or maybe you'll get aggressive. But that match has to maintain itself intact, or your entire nervous system gets dysregulated. And the reason for that is that as soon as that match is disrupted, the underlying complexity and chaos of the world reveals itself, and so does your inadequacy. And then your body defaults into predator mode, and the fact that you don't know anything and that everything is really complicated becomes very evident to you very quickly. And people hate that. It's the worst thing that can happen to them, the bottom falling out of their world. And so that happens more when your fundamental presumptions about things are challenged. And then you have to solve the problem of what constitutes a fundamental presupposition. You know, how do you know which presupposition is peripheral and which one's central? And you can tell in part because the more upset you get about something, the more central it is that thing's about to your entire structure of belief. And that's one way of getting into that unconscious structure of belief from a psychoanalytic perspective. So one of the things that happens to me, for example, as a therapist, is I'll be talking to my clients and they'll be talking about something difficult, and all of a sudden they'll cry. And they often don't know why, so I stop them right there. It's like something went through your mind, something happened. And the cry indicates that you've moved beyond your domain of competence out into the unknown world, all of a sudden, into chaos. What's that chaos? What exactly happened? And people, you know, they're usually embarrassed that they cry, but often they can remember what flitted through their mind, and it's some encounter with the chaos beyond their conceptual systems that produces that emotional response. And then we can dig into that and find out, oh, that's a trauma, especially if it's more than a year and a half old. And those can be of various depths and profundity. You know, sometimes they're so bad that the person just breaks down completely and they never put themselves together. You know, that's when something's just walloped you. It's hit you right at the bottom of your axiomatic structure, so to speak, right at the trunk. But when you're doing therapy with people and you watch how they respond emotionally, you look for those tiny eruptions of negative emotion. And those are like holes in their conceptual structure. And those have to be sewed up by them and you in the process of dialogue. You figure out, okay, there was a bit of unexplored territory there that manifested itself. It produced an emotional response in you that indicates that you've reverted in some sense to childhood. That would be the Freudian interpretation. Now we have to figure out what it was that's in that hole, what caused that tear, and then we have to go back and articulate it and analyze it and study it until we can sew it up and then and get to the gist of it, to make it into a adaptive story, and then you can leave it behind. And it actually produces neurological transformation as you do that. The memories in some sense actually move their psychophysiological location, you could say, their location in your psyche. But you can also note that the brain systems that are handling the memories aren't the same. So they're much more limbic, they're way lower and closer to the emotional centers when it's still raw trauma, and by the time it's fully articulated, it's more represented in an articulated story, a causal story. And that's partly why writing about emotional events actually helps you overcome them. So, and it's possible that writing about how it is that you overcome emotional events in general is actually the best kind of therapy, right? Not how do you solve a particular problem, but how is it that you orient yourself in the world so that you solve the class of the fact that there are problems, right? That's the ultimate story, and I think that's the hero myth, and I also think that that's the knowledge generating process that Piaget is talking about. That's because you're constantly overcoming problems in the world, and the problems are that you don't know enough to get what you want from the world, and so you get that mismatch. You've got whole brain systems that are designed to do nothing but detect that mismatch, like crucial central brain structures, and we'll talk about that a lot when we get into the physiology.